Our scripture for this morning comes from the book of Genesis, the 50th chapter, beginning with the 15th verse. Hear these words. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, 'I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. This reveals to us the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
It's one of my very favorite Bible stories, for it's one of the few times that the Bible unfolds for us the story of a person's life from the time of their birth throughout their life to the time of their death. I mean, we don't even experience that benefit in the biblical account of Jesus' life. I mean, sure, we know that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary in Bethlehem. He was circumcised, he was dedicated, and then 12 years pass, and we know nothing about those 12 years. And then we hear again that when he's 12 years old, that Jesus is in the temple in Jerusalem, and then after that, he's 30 years old before the scriptures pick up his life until his crucifixion, death, and resurrection. So there is another 18 years that we can only speculate about. But this Old Testament story follows a life from birth until death, which helps us to see the development, the maturing of the individual. I like this story because it's a story of transformation and call. The story of someone who was so arrogant as to view himself as being like a God, but eventually becoming humble enough to express the grace of God. The story of one who God's call moved him from adoration of a life of privilege to the faithfulness of embracing a life of authentic purpose, God's purpose. It's the story of Jacob and Rebekah's son, Joseph. Now, before we move into that story, let me remind you that we are in the middle of a sermon series that focuses upon God's call and how it influences and transforms our lives. Kyle has shared sermons that highlighted Levi's conversion call to discipleship and Martha's call to trust God during troubling times, even when God seems distant or silent. Last week I shared a sermon on how God's call moved Paul from the ambition of seeking adoration for himself to giving himself to God's kingdom work, and how God's call directed Ananias to take a big step of faith to encourage Paul's faith development. We believe that each of these sermons proclaim truth that can be helpful to each of us in our spiritual growth. So if you missed any of them, I suggest that you go to our church's website and follow the links that will enable you to view them. Now, in preparation for hearing God's truth for our lives today, would you join with me in just a moment of prayer? Oh Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. You may recall that Rebekah was the love of Jacob's life. In fact, he worked 7 years for his soon-to-be father-in-law Laban for the right to marry Rebekah. And at the big wedding celebration, Laban pulled off a scheme of getting Jacob drunk And then he switched daughters at the ceremony, so that Jacob ended up being married to Leah, Rachel's older sister. Of course, the customs of that day and age allowed for men to have more than one wife, so Jacob contracted with Laban to work 7 more years for him so that he could embrace Rachel as his wife as well. Over the course of time, Leah delivered 5 sons to Jacob, but Rachel was barren. This creates a great deal of contention, competition between the 2 sisters for the attention and affection of their husband Jacob. It gets so bad that they even give their maids for Jacob to conceive with, and all of this dysfunctional behavior within the family leads to Jacob having 10 sons and at least 1 daughter. Finally, Rachel conceived, and she gave birth to Joseph. And he became the apple of Jacob's eye. He was favored above all the others by his father. He was pampered. He was spoiled. All his siblings knew that he was favored. In fact, to make sure that there was no question about the fact that Jacob was the apple of his father's eyes, Joseph presented him with that celebrated coat of many colors. As you might imagine, sibling rivalry kicked into high gear, and to add fuel to the fire were Joseph's dreams of greatness, dreams he arrogantly shared with his brothers. Hey, big brothers, let me tell you what I dreamed of last night. We were all binding sheaves out in the field one day, and suddenly my sheaf rose and it stood upright, and then all of your sheaves gathered around and they bowed down to my sheaf. Oh, and there was this other dream I had as well. There was the sun, there was the moon, and 11 stars, and they all bowed down to me. Well, those dreams were the straws that broke the camel's back. And the brothers decided they had all of Joseph, his arrogance, his entitled for privilege mindset. They had all of Joseph that they could take. So they decided to kill him. But then they had a second thought, realizing they could benefit themselves by selling him into slavery, which they did. Without a doubt, it was a humbling experience for Joseph to go from dreams of being high and mighty to the life of a slave. Yet in that situation, he perceived that God was calling him to be an exemplary servant and a person of unquestionable integrity. In response to God's call, Joseph always gave his very best effort at whatever task was assigned him, which was rewarded with greater responsibility in his master's household. But as we all well know, evil exists in this world of ours, and life can be terribly unjust at times. And Joseph felt the sting of that reality when he refused the sexual advances of his master's wife. As a result, he was accused by her of impropriety and thrown into prison. Though life has been anything but fair to Joseph, even in prison, he continues to live into God's call to embrace the values of a strong and determined work ethic and the highest of moral and ethical conduct, to the point that he earns the trust of the head jailer, and he's given the responsibility to be a servant, caring for the needs of the other prisoners. Are you starting to see a pattern here? God keeps calling Joseph to develop empathy for the plight and the needs of others, and to invest himself in striving to minister to them. Quite a change for a guy whose dream was to be served, not to serve. Anyway, it's in prison that we learn that God has gifted Joseph with the ability to interpret dreams. And eventually he's invited to interpret a couple of nightmares that Pharaoh has suffered through. In interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph warns of an impending, life-threatening famine, and he offers some insight into how lives can be saved if the years of plenty are managed correctly. So Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of being the manager of all of Egypt, helping prepare the country for the crisis that is looming on the horizon. In fact, Joseph is second only to Pharaoh himself. Looks like those dreams Joseph had as a boy of becoming high and mighty are finally coming true. But as the story continues to unfold, we see that God's call has transformed Joseph's value system. His dream, the focus of his life is no longer on being a leader who exploits his position for personal privilege and pleasure. Now he's empathetic and concerned about those who are suffering from the hardships and the unfairness of life. He's driven by God's purpose for his life to care for others and to provide for their needs, doing what he can to sustain their lives. It is in the midst of Joseph's labors to save lives that those who plotted to take his life come back into the scene. His brothers arrive, having traveled from their home in Canaan to Egypt, because their family is now on the verge of starvation. Doesn't take much imagination to understand how very easy it would be for Joseph to be vindictive, to exact his revenge from these brothers who had hurt him so deeply. In fact, we can probably all think of people in leadership positions who would do just that in a heartbeat. But God has been working on Joseph's heart, filling it with grace. So not only did Joseph save the lives of those who had callously wronged him, but he forgave them. That reality is powerfully proclaimed in Joseph's words to his brother. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." Notice in that statement, Joseph no longer sees himself in a God-like position, thinking of himself as the center of the universe and entitled for privilege as he did at one point in his time, in his life. Now, he has developed a humble spirit. And in the mercy he shows, he expresses the grace of God. What a dynamic story of the transformational power of God's call. As Joseph was moved from being an arrogant jerk to having a humble and merciful spirit. From lusting for privilege to living with purpose. Living with purpose. That is what God calls all of us to do, regardless of our age or stage in life. I'm reminded of a story that captures someone who embraced God's call to become a servant, living with purpose, and how her example affected others. A newspaper reporter is standing at a rescue mission in the inner city, watching the poor come and get food to eat. And he writes this of his experience. The line was long, but moving briskly. And in that line at the very end stood a young girl, about 12 years of age. She waited very patiently as those in front of her received a little rice, some canned goods, or a little fruit. Slowly but surely, she got closer and closer to the front of the line, closer to the food. And from time to time, she would glance across the street. She did not notice the growing concern on the faces of those distributing the food. The food was running out. Their anxiety began to show a bit, but she did not notice, for her attention was focused on 3 figures under the tree and across the street. At long last, she stepped forward to get her food, but the only thing left was one lonely banana. The workers were almost ashamed to tell her that was all that was left, but she did not seem to mind. In fact, she seemed genuinely happy to get that solitary banana. Quietly, she took the precious gift and ran across the street where 3 small children waited, perhaps her sisters and a brother. Very deliberately, she peeled the banana, divided it into 3 equal parts, placing the precious food in the eager hands of those 3 younger ones. "One for you," she said, "and one for you, and one for you." Then she sat down and licked the inside of the banana peel herself. And then the reporter said, "I swear, I saw the face of God that day." In her caring for others, that little girl revealed the face of God. Same thing with Joseph. As he lived with purpose, extending compassion to others, he revealed the face of God. Each time I hear stories of those who have answered God's call to live with purpose, I'm challenged to make an honest, personal examination. Challenged to wrestle with how I see myself in relationship to others. Do I arrogantly want others to bow to my wishes and whims, or am I striving toward a humility that enables me to be more empathetic and understanding so I can offer others grace and compassion and mercy? Challenged to wrestle with the values that are truly at the heart of my life. Am I driven by a desire for privilege and for pleasure, or am I striving to live into God's purpose for my life? Ultimately, challenged to wrestle with the question, am I paying any attention to God at all?